Well, now it's time for The Empire Strikes Back, Part 4. We're going to continue by looking at how World War II expanded into a conflict the likes of which the world had never seen. Now, as a result of the Germans' inability to win the Battle of Britain, Hitler set his eyes eastward. Seeking Lebensraum, or more living space, Hitler ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, which was called Operation Barbarossa, clearly breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact. Believing the Slavs were subhumans, Hitler felt they would fall within months to the master race. And this took the Soviet Union by surprise. As one report went, Stalin fainted when he first heard of the news, and he suffered a nervous breakdown for days. Eventually, the British, and later the Americans, would ally with the Soviet Union. This is a perfect example of the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The Germans did not take a focused approach in their attack, instead taking the city of Kiev, as you see here, and also besieging Leningrad as well as Moscow. But similar to what the Russians had done during Napoleon's invasion, they used scorched earth to extend their enemy's supply lines. The Soviet resistance was more persistent than Germany had anticipated, and the Soviets' superior numbers kept defending their cities block by block. Then came the Russians' greatest ally, the winter. The Soviets staged a massive counterattack, and the Germans were forced to retreat for the first time in World War II. Now here's a short video about Operation Barbarossa that you can watch, but don't feel obligated to take notes.
In June 1941, 135 divisions plunged deep into Russia on a 1,500-mile front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Hitler expected a quick knockout blow within a matter of weeks. Napoleon's invasion more than a century before, everything went almost too well. The German infantry found it difficult to keep up with the tanks that smashed through the Russian defenses. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. But the Soviets could afford to sacrifice both men and territory. They had plenty of both, and in their retreat, they gained time. As the Germans advanced, all they found were burning buildings, for the Russians had scorched the earth, depriving their enemy of winter quarters. And guerrilla fighters sabotaged German lines of communication. In the big cities like Stalingrad and Moscow, the people were put to work barricading the streets. The Russians are stubborn fighters, and they were going to fight for every street, every house. Outside the towns, the women and old men were sent to dig huge tank traps to help stop the German advance. But with the Germans at the very gates of Moscow, the deadly cold of a Russian winter arrived. Not having bothered to equip his troops with winter uniforms, Hitler was reluctantly forced to call a halt, with victory almost within his grasp.
Now, another momentous event occurred in the winter of 1941, but we'll have to give some background first. In 1935, Congress passed a Neutrality Act that imposed a general embargo on trading in arms and war materials with all parties in a war. It also declared that the American citizens traveling on warring ships traveled at their own risk. In 1937, Congress passed a new Neutrality Act that included a cash and carry provision, which stated the president could permit the sale of materials and supplies to belligerents in Europe as long as the recipients arranged for the transport and paid immediately in cash. The argument was that this would not draw the United States into conflict. FDR believed that cash and carry would aid France and Great Britain in the event of a war with Germany. 1941 marked the end of neutrality with the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to sell, lend, or give war materials to nations the administration wanted to support. The Allies could buy goods on credit. And after repeated attacks by German submarines on United States ships, FDR ordered the United States Navy to attack German and Italian war vessels in waters which the United States deemed necessary for its defense. Now, the Atlantic Charter was drafted at the secretly held Atlantic Conference in August of 1941 by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in Newfoundland. It set goals rather than a blueprint for the post-war world. There were 8 points of the Charter, similar to Wilson's 14 points, such as language encouraging territorial adjustments and self-determination, trade barriers were to be lowered, and participants of the war were to work toward freedom and cooperation. In doing so, FDR pledged the Allies all aid short of war. Now, the Axis powers interpreted the Atlantic Charter as a potential alliance against them, and Tokyo, in particular, pushed for a more aggressive approach against the US and Britain. Japan advanced southward from Manchuria through cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. They wanted to rid Asia of foreign powers and communists and expand their empire. Jiang Zeisha and the nationalists defended against the Japanese to the best that they could. An example of one of the terrible events was what's called the Rape of Nanjing, where over 200,000 Chinese were massacred and thousands of women were raped, and this led to massive international condemnation. In 1940, the Tripartite Pact was signed, which officially established the Axis powers of Japan, Germany, Italy, and several Balkan states. And in the winter of 1941, Japan engaged in several unprovoked and simultaneous attacks on U.S. and British territories, striking Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and later on at Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines. Now, the following details are more than you need to know, but Japan's first air fleet, bolstered by 8 aircraft carriers, attacked Pearl Harbor by surprise on December 7, 1941, incurring over 3,000 casualties and massive damage to the American Pacific Fleet. The first wave of 183 Japanese planes bombed ships and airfields on Oahu, and their second attack of 168 planes concentrated on other ships and shipyard facilities. Fighters strafed ground targets, and bombers launched torpedoes. The American Pacific Fleet was effectively crippled, with 8 battleships and 10 other vessels sunk or damaged, with almost 300 planes destroyed or damaged. An imperial mandate had been given to Hideki Tojo to become premier of Japan months before the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and clearly he had dealt a devastating blow to the defenses of the United States. However, 3 U.S. aircraft carriers had fortunately been out at sea on maneuvers and were untouched during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And supposedly one Japanese admiral stated, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." The following day, on December 8th, FDR delivered a war declaration against Japan that Congress overwhelmingly approved.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Soon, the United States would ally with Great Britain and declare war against the Axis powers. One particularly horrific event that occurred soon after Pearl Harbor was the Bataan Death March. As the Japanese were attacking the U.S. and Allied forces in the Pacific with impunity, General Douglas MacArthur was forced to leave the Philippines, telling his men, "I shall return." In the face of the Japanese, with superior numbers of troops, ships, and aircraft, it was necessary to evacuate General MacArthur and other high-level officers for several reasons. For one, they knew top-secret information that could be forced from them through interrogation and torture. And furthermore, their ranks made them extremely valuable POWs, who could be used as leverage by the enemy. Around 78,000 Allied troops were captured at Bataan in the Philippines. The Japanese were unprepared to deal with such high numbers. They sent the POWs on a 68-mile march through jungle and rugged terrain. Survivors of this march told of the brutal treatment at the hands of the Japanese, who thought it to be a dishonorable disgrace to surrender, and they bayoneted or shot men who lagged behind, even killing men who attempted to help their friends. Thousands of Filipinos and hundreds of U.S. troops were killed before they reached their final destination at an internment camp. Although this event was tragic, with the full power of the American nation behind the war effort, and with the Soviet Union now fully engaged, the tide of the war was about to change.
Hey, come out! My God, they're gonna kill us all!